Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I am doing my 2020 stats and reflections and my 2021 goals. So let's go ahead and start with the stats. 2020 ended up being actually a very similar reading year for me compared to 2019. Many of the stats that I'm going to go through are almost identical to last year. So if you're interested, I will link that video as well below, but really a lot of similarities. So even though 2020 was a very interesting year in terms of the real world, in terms of my reading, it kind of was normal. So I read 173 books, which was 39,310 pages, averaging about 227 pages per book. So I definitely read a lot of short things, which is pretty typical for me. 2020 was the first year that I tracked my DNFs, or did not finishes, as well as NFNs, or not for nows, which is a category that I came up with for books that I put down because I'm not in the mood for them, but I may come back to later, whereas DNFs I'm never coming back to. So I ended up with 28 books that were DNFs or NFNs, for a total of 1,451 pages read. On average, I DNF'd books at around 22%. Looking at the number of books that I read per month, it varied pretty widely. So my smallest reading month was July, where I read 6 books. My highest reading month was September, where I read 28 books. But on average, I read around 14 books per month. Looking at number of pages read per month, there is a slightly different story going on, but still a bit of variation. My smallest reading month was March, where I read 1,708 pages, and my highest page reading month was May, where I read 4,447 pages. This clearly does not line up with the number of books that I read, partially because there is such variation in terms of the lengths of books that I read. So on average, I read about 3,276 pages per month. Next, looking at the breakdown of how many pages per book I read, it looks like there's a pretty even-ish distribution between everything that is under 100 through up to 400, with only a small sliver of what I read higher than that. Just 3% of my books were over 500 pages and 6% were between 400 and 500. Everything else was pretty evenly split, and that makes a lot of sense. I read a lot of shorter things. The shortest thing that I read this year was kind of tied between many different picture books because a lot of them apparently are 32 pages long. But the first one that I read in 2020 that was 32 pages was Just Ask by Sonia Sotomayor, illustrated by Rafael Lopez. The longest book that I read was 1,006 pages, and that is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. Next, looking at the star ratings that I gave for the books that I read, we can see that I really loved the books that I read. About 80% of the books that I read, I gave 4 or more stars. I had an average rating of 4.38 stars, which is very high. Although I will say that this is for books that I finished that I gave star ratings to. Only 1% of the books that I read did I give 2.5 stars to, so I really liked the books that I read, including 72 5-star books. But I mean, I had a great reading year. However, I did think it would be interesting to take a look at what my star ratings would be if I included my DNFs and NFNs, given that I actually tracked them in 2020. So I went ahead and took a look at what this chart would look like if I included those DNFs and NFNs as 2.5 star reads, because I think that might be a little bit of an average of what I might give those books if I had finished them. So taking a look at the chart with that actually lowers my average to 4.11 stars, which is still pretty high. And I still really loved a lot of what I read, but it bumps up that 2.5 stars to 15% of what I read. Next, I wanted to take a look at the breakdown of how much I read that was text-based work versus how much I read that was graphic. So I read a ton of children's picture books and comics and manga and illustrated things. So I wanted to take a look at how that broke down in terms of percentages. So for the number of books that I read that were graphic versus textual, about 36% were graphic. But if we take a look at page count, actually only 22% of the pages that I read were graphic. So even though I am reading quite a large percentage of my books as graphic things, they're not necessarily counting for as many of the pages that I read, leaving me still with over 30,000 pages read of like traditional text-based works. Now taking a look at book format, the format that was most common for me were novels. 67 of the books that I read were novels. The least common format was manga, but I read quite a lot of collections, so that is essay collections or short story collections, and also quite a lot of picture books this year. Looking at age category, again, my reading is heavily dominated by adult works. I read 114 things that were adult works, but I did still have quite a few middle grade and children's books. Next, looking at the fiction genres that I read this year, I read a ton of fantasy, which is no surprise. That is definitely my go-to genre, as well as quite a bit of contemporary, which I think is because I'm getting a little bit more into some literary fiction, and a lot of sci-fi, no surprise. This year, my fewest read fiction genres were a play, I read one play, and a thriller, I read one thriller. Looking at the nonfiction genres that I read the most in social justice this year, which makes a ton of sense because that was one of my priorities for the year, one of the projects I had, followed by memoirs, which I love, as well as biographies, which I also love. I did read one cookbook and one self-help book this year. So those are all of my general stats for 2020. Now I want to look at the sort of stats that relate to the goals that I had for the year, beginning with my reading goals. First, I had two main goals: to read at least 75 books, which I accomplished. I read 173, and to read at least 30,000 pages, which I accomplished. I read over 39,000. Next, I had a number of sub-goals, beginning with reading at least 25 nonfiction books, which I accomplished. I read 38 nonfiction books, although a number of these were children's pictured nonfiction books, but they were still excellent and I definitely count them. Next, I had a goal of reading at least 12 non-English books, which I very much failed at. I read only 6 out of 12. So only 50% success rate there, not so great, although I did sort of mid-year realize that this was no longer kind of a strong priority for me, so it doesn't upset me that I didn't meet this goal. Next, I had a number of sub-goals that related to the diversity of my reading. So I wanted to read at least 60% by female authors, which I accomplished. I read over 77% of the books by female authors. I also wanted at least 60% of the books that I read to be by POC authors, and this I just barely met. I read just over 60%. Next, I wanted at least 25% of the books that I read to be by queer authors or to focus on queer characters, and this I accomplished. Over 27% of the things that I read were queer. And lastly, I wanted at least 10% of what I read to be by disabled authors or focused on disabled characters, and this I accomplished at 15%. Now moving on to my channel goals for 2020, beginning with posting about 2 to 3 times a week, which I did. I ended up posting 153 videos in 2020, which is an average of just under 3 videos a week, which makes sense. Many of the weeks in 2020, I was posting that third video because I had things that I wanted to talk about. I also did Vlogmas, which was a lot of videos, although the very last week in December, I completely skipped, so that's the only week where I didn't really post anything. Next, I wanted to make more standalone review and discussion videos rather than just the weekly wrap-ups, and I did accomplish this. It made me very happy. I did 33 standalone videos, which is much larger than in 2019 where I had done only 10. I also wanted to add closed captions for all of my weekly wrap-ups, which I accomplished. Every single weekly wrap-up that I did in 2020 had closed captions, and almost all of my other videos do as well. There were only 7 videos in the first half of the year that I didn't get to add closed captions to, and that was mainly because either I had some vacation issues where I just didn't end up having time, or there were some issues with YouTube's auto captioning that made it very, very hard for me to go in and do it completely from scratch. But I have had a lot of advice from other booktubers that I really appreciate that has helped me kind of fill in those gaps. So the second half of the year is all CC'd. And overall, I had over 95% of the videos in 2020 with closed captions. In addition to the general channel goals that I had, I also had 3 projects that I was working on in 2020 for my channel. The first was a non-English book project, which did not go so well. I had wanted to read 1 non-English book a month and also record a review of it in the language that I read it in. So I ended up reading 6 books that weren't in English. However, I only did 1 review in non-English language at the very beginning of the year, and I just realized halfway through the year that this was no longer a priority for me, and it was kind of just a little bit of an obligation and a burden rather than something I was looking forward to. So I kind of gave up on that project, and I think that although I still do have a lot of non-English children's books that I would like to read, it isn't something that I'm necessarily going to be pushing for, but just reading when I'm in the mood. Next, I had a social justice nonfiction project where I wanted to read 1 social justice nonfiction book each month and then do a video discussion talking about the main points in it. So I did pretty good on the reading. I read 11 books that I would count as part of this. But I only did about 5 videos. So I found, again, halfway through the year that stress of trying to take such detailed notes and trying to summarize the main points was making it not so much fun. Also, I'm not sure that it was that useful for people because it was not really so much a review as it was a discussion of what the main topics were, which if somebody was interested, they would just go read the book. So I'm really, really glad that I read the books, but I realized that making those videos wasn't as important to me, and rather I would do reviews if I really loved a book and wanted people to go ahead and read it. So I'm glad that this got me to read more social justice nonfiction, even if the video part of it was not as much of a success. Then the last project that I was working on was my monthly priorities project, which went pretty well. So for that, other than January and December, my goal was each month to have a specific priority of some type of background or heritage or something that I was prioritizing that month, and this went pretty well. So the only month that I did not do this for is April. The pandemic hitting in March just really slowed down my reading, and I ended up extending my March priority through April and skipping the April one altogether. But even so, every other month I did this and I really enjoyed it. I ended up reading quite a few different books for these priorities. Some months I was a little bit more on target than other months. On average, I read just over 3 books that were on my TBR each month, plus on average another 4 books that weren't on my TBR, for just around 7 books total for each priority, which is pretty good, and I'm just pretty happy with that. So those are all of the numbers for 2020, the stats and sort of what my goals were and how I did on them. Now I want to reflect a little bit on my reading year. The first thing that I noticed about my reading in 2020 is that it was actually so similar to 2019. So again, like there was a lot going on in the world, but I found that in general, my reading was pretty normal. Reading is one of those things that I think for me and a lot of people is a little bit of an escape from the real world, but also is just something that keeps me sane. I was very surprised though. I thought I would see some sort of difference in my reading, and I didn't really, beyond a couple of small changes that were just me getting into specific things like reading a bit more horror or reading a bit more children's books or middle grade, things like that. Another thing that I realized about my reading in 2020 is that I love buddy reads. I did so many buddy reads in 2020, generally about 2 per month, but there were no months in which I did none, although I did DNF a couple of the books that I buddy read. I really had such a great time with buddy reads. Buddy reads were such a valuable part of my reading experience in 2020, and I really, really thank every single person who did a buddy read with me because it was awesome. I love getting to discuss all of those spoilery thoughts. I love having that buddy to get me to pick up a book that maybe I would have waited on even though I've really wanted to read it. So it was such an awesome experience, and I definitely am excited to do a lot of buddy reads in 2021 as well. Sort of a related point is that I really loved reading out loud with Sush. So this is something that you'll hear me mention every once in a while in a wrap-up, even though I don't necessarily count it as a buddy read. But Sush and I read a ton of books out loud to each other this year. It was such a great experience because it's like a buddy read plus, because there is instantaneous stopping and discussing as we're going of whatever is happening in the book. There's a lot of times that we read out loud to each other books that we had already finished but just wanted to share with the other. And then we also read a ton of new releases by favorite authors and a bunch of books that were for different awards that we both wanted to get through, and it was just such a great experience. So I love reading out loud with Sush. It's one of the joys of my reading year. And lastly, just a little bit of a reflection on some of my channel content. I found that this year I was so happy reviewing books. So definitely there's lots of other types of innovative content that I've seen so many different booktubers doing, but I found that this year with doing so many standalone reviews, I really like it. Standalone reviews are that opportunity to think a little bit more deeply about what specifically made a book work for me. If you're not super familiar, I tend to only do reviews for books that were like ones that were 5 stars that I loved so much that I want other people to pick up. But it just gives me that opportunity to delve a little deeper than I would in a wrap-up, and I love it so much. So I definitely really enjoyed that, and I'm glad that I did that this year. So now I want to talk about 2021 and what my goals are for this coming year. Basically, it could be titled More of the Same. I really like what I've been doing, and I want to continue along very similar veins. So first, my reading goals. I actually decided to pare these down to just 3 things. Many of the things that I had as reading goals in 2020, I realized I was reaching without really even trying, such as the number of books or the pages or nonfiction. It just wasn't something that I needed to focus on. But there are a couple of things that I do need to focus on and that I'd like to stretch just a little bit more on, in particular in the voices that I'm making space for in my reading. I noticed that there is a constant pull towards a lot of mainstream books. When I watch BookTube and I hear people talking about things, there's a lot of books that are really awesome, but that are by such mainstream authors, whereas a lot of the more marginalized authors aren't getting quite the hype. And so I have to pay a little bit more attention to making sure I make space for them in my reading. So that's what my 3 main goals are. The first is that I would like 65% of what I read to be by POC authors. I would like 30% to be by queer authors or about queer characters, and I would like 15% to be by disabled authors or about disabled characters. So that's just basically 5% more in each of these 3 categories than I had before, but I really want to focus on making that a habit in how I decide what books that I'm adding to my TBR and focusing on. And then for my channel goals for 2021, they are very similar to last year. I want to do 2 to 3 videos per week on my channel. I think that I found that is a very sustainable pace for me, but it also gives me a lot of the space that I need to go into the depth that I want to on various books. So I really liked that pace and I want to maintain it. I also want to continue to do a lot of standalone reviews and discussion videos. I just really like doing them. They make me very happy. And I really want to focus on making sure that I do a lot of these for new releases by marginalized authors. The more I'm on BookTube, the more that I realize what a difference it can make for an author to have their new release reviewed right after it is released. That is part of what helps their book become successful. I think in previous years for me, new releases, backlist, it was all very much the same, but now I'm starting to realize what value it can be to get that review out pretty close to when the book is released. So I want to try to get to a few more of those than I otherwise would have. Next, I want to make sure that I add closed captions to all of my videos, that none of them go up without closed captions. Definitely, it can be a little bit frustrating sometimes when YouTube doesn't add the auto captions, since I rely on that for my captioning process. But again, I've had a couple of really amazing booktubers give me some hints of workarounds, so I think that I can make this work, and I just want to make it a priority. I also want to continue to do my monthly priorities. Even though the other two projects that I tried in 2020 didn't work so much for me, the monthly priorities is something that I have been doing for the past 2 years and I really enjoy it. So I will have a video coming up soon talking about what my priorities are for 2021. Okay, so that wraps up all of my stats and reflections from 2020 and my goals for 2021. I hope that you guys had a good reading year in 2020 and that 2021 is shaping up to be another great reading year. There are so many amazing books out there that I cannot wait to read. If you guys have any thoughts, any comments, anything you want to talk about my stats, or anything that you want to share about how your stats were or what your goals are for this coming year, I'd love to hear from you. So leave me a comment down below.